The second day after winning the lottery, my husband, Michael, suggested we get a divorce. He had been cheating on me with his red rose from his youth. I was stunned, unable to believe what was happening. $100 million. Staring at the lottery winnings. My mind went blank for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't until my son, Ethan, tugged at my hand repeatedly that I finally came back to my senses. That's when I realized that this miraculous fortune had truly landed in my lap. With this money, the house loan, the car debt, Michael's struggling company, and even my dream of traveling around the world, all of it could be solved effortlessly. The sheer excitement made me feel dizzy, and I plopped down onto the floor in shock. "Mom, are you okay?" Ethan's big, round, grape-like eyes gazed at me, full of concern. My sweet boy. His innocence was heartwarming. I blinked and steadied myself, then double-checked the ticket. It was real. I had actually won the lottery. I scooped Ethan into my arms and started laughing uncontrollably. "Haha, we're going to travel the world." Ethan, though only 3 years old, laughed along with me, clapping his hands and bouncing with joy. Who would have thought? That day at the grocery store, I had used the leftover change to buy a lottery ticket, just for fun. And now, it had turned into a massive windfall. I forced myself to calm down, and memories of Michael's weary expression over the past few days flashed through my mind, along with the disappointed look in Ethan's eyes when he saw the Gundam model he wanted but couldn't have. Tears of joy filled my eyes. I carefully tucked the lottery ticket into my jacket pocket, then took Ethan out to celebrate. We feasted on king crab, a luxury I had never dared to buy before. I also got him the Gundam model he had been longing for. Ethan hugged me tightly, leaving my face smeared with his sticky kisses. "EW, you little piggy," I teased, gently pushing him away to wash up. Feeling lighthearted, I returned to the kitchen to prepare dinner. I decided I would share the good news with Michael today. But before I could, I received a text from him. "Working late tonight. Won't be home for dinner." Reading his message, I sighed. Busy again. But then again, I had grown used to it. Since I was in a great mood, I decided to surprise him by bringing dinner to his office. I couldn't help but wonder if Michael would still maintain his indifferent attitude once he found out I had won the lottery. Smiling to myself, I started preparing 3 luxurious dishes: steamed eggs with crab roe sauce, Hong Kong-style salt-baked crab, and steamed crab legs. These were dishes I'd only ever seen online or eaten at my mom's house during special occasions. But today, I finally had the courage to buy them myself. I packed the food and made my way to Michael's company. Michael's company, which he had started 3 years ago, was clearly established. But lately, it had been struggling financially. He hadn't come home for 2 days and must have been exhausted. But now that I had won the lottery, he wouldn't have to work so hard anymore. Wouldn't it be better for the 3 of us to travel the world together? The thought brought a smile to my face, and I couldn't stop grinning. Even in the elevator, a young woman beside me gave me a strange look, but I didn't care. When I arrived at the office, the space was empty. I decided to set up the food to surprise Michael, but as I approached the door, I heard strange noises from inside. My heart sank. I quietly pushed the door open, and dim light spilled out. Then I heard a woman's sultry voice. "Michael, when are you going to divorce her? I came back for you. You know. Soon." Michael replied, his voice heavy with breath. "The company's finances are almost sorted. Once that's done, I'll tell her." "You're not planning to give her much money, are you?" The woman's voice was dripping with disdain. "Don't worry. I'm over 10 million in debt. She'll walk away empty-handed. But her family is wealthy. Even if she ends up with nothing, so what? I'm not raising her kid. We'll have our own children. Don't worry about that." Hearing this, the woman giggled, and the 2 of them embraced passionately. I stood frozen, my mind spinning. How could Michael say such vile things and still act as though he cared about me? These 2 people, how could they be so shameless? But I bit my lip and forced myself to stay rational. The company debt he dumped on me? What about that? I would have to pay it all back. How could I walk away without being crushed by the pain? I don't even remember how I left his office. The only thing I recall is that when I came back to my senses, I had thrown the lunchbox hard into the trash. Crab legs and sauce splattered everywhere. A chaotic mess. Just like my marriage. The most painful part? I knew who she was. Vanessa. She was my sister-in-law Emily's classmate. A year ago, she even went out of her way to connect with me on WeChat. At the time, I found it strange, but Michael brushed it off, saying, "She's only 5 years younger than me. I've watched her grow up since she was a kid. It's not like I'm some kind of animal. Stop overthinking." He convinced me not to dwell on it. And Vanessa, with her endless posts on social media showing off the luxurious gifts from her boyfriend, lulled me into a false sense of security. I even felt a little envious. Michael had never bought me an expensive gift. Not even a bouquet on Valentine's Day. Now, thinking back, it was all an act. Just for me to see. I was such a fool. The worst part? Michael was always a clean freak. He never kissed me. And now I knew why. It wasn't because of some obsession with cleanliness, but because he looked down on me. The pain of betrayal, coupled with the overwhelming humiliation, nearly shattered me. We dated for a year and had been married for 5. I had always considered our small home my entire world. When he first started his business, no one supported him. Except me. I gave him all of my dowry money, along with the savings I'd painstakingly accumulated over the years. And him? He conspired with another woman to ruin me. Fine. Just fine. I was so furious I had to take deep breaths to calm myself. If this was how things were going to be, he wouldn't get a single cent of my lottery winnings. The next afternoon, Michael came home, his face full of gloom, looking like he'd been hit hard. In the past, I would have been worried, running to him, eager to comfort him. But now? I had to be even more attentive. How else could I keep up the act until he finally discarded me? "Are you okay? Did something happen at work?" I poured him a glass of warm water and sat beside him, feigning concern. He took a deep breath and sipped the water before speaking. "There's an issue with the company's cash flow. We owe a significant amount, and it needs to be repaid soon. Do we still have any savings at home?" His eyes were full of hope as he looked at me. This had been before. I would have borrowed money from my parents without hesitation. How could anyone let the person they love suffer? Even when I won the lottery, the first person I thought of sharing the news with was him. But after last night, he was already dead to me. And now, he wanted to squeeze out whatever was left of my savings, forcing me into a corner. This man disgusted me. Thankfully, I had stayed up all night preparing. By morning, I had spent every last penny. I just used $100,000 to buy an insurance policy for Ethan. It'll cover him until he's 18. Oh, and I renewed his taekwondo classes for another year. I feigned regret and added, "Why didn't you tell me earlier? You're always saying not to bother you with household matters." Michael frowned, looking at the freshly printed insurance documents. He let out a deep sigh. But since it was all for our son, he couldn't exactly scold me for spending the money. He hesitated before asking, "So, there's no other savings left at all?" "There's a little bit," I said casually. I opened our joint account, showing the balance. $9.865.73. Just enough to cover the house and car payments for the next month. Every expense was meticulously documented. And as he scrolled through the statements, he even saw entries for money I had spent on his parents. After that, he didn't look further. Michael visibly let out a sigh of relief. From his calculating expression, I could tell he was already scheming something. "Nina, I need to talk to you," he said, breaking the silence. I smiled at him, but in truth, my hand gripping the insurance papers was trembling because I knew what he wanted. To propose a divorce. I wasn't ready for it. Not yet. I didn't even know the full state of his company's affairs. Even if I had won the lottery, that money was mine. And I wasn't about to let that despicable pair benefit from it. That moment, Ethan rubbed his sleepy eyes as he walked out of his room. "Daddy, you're back. I missed you so much," he exclaimed as he ran to Michael and hugged him tightly, acting playfully. Michael's usually cold expression softened slightly as he patted Ethan's head. "Have you been a good boy for Mommy?" he asked. "Yes, I have. Last night, I ate a big crab with Mommy, and I was so full," Ethan said proudly. "Good job. That's my little man," Michael responded, lifting Ethan up and tossing him playfully in the air. Ethan giggled uncontrollably, his laughter filling the room. Watching this warm scene, I felt no comfort. Instead, a wave of unease washed over me. A small part of me wavered, wondering if Michael was trying to charm me. After all, we had Ethan. Divorce would hurt him deeply. I could endure judgmental or scornful looks, but I couldn't bear the thought of how the separation might affect Ethan. Would it make him feel unloved or unworthy? How would I even begin to ask Ethan who he would want to live with if Michael and I divorced? I only wanted to protect him, to give him a happy childhood for as long as I could still take care of him. At the very least, he deserved some good memories. These thoughts brought tears to my eyes. I used to think women who clung to a marriage for their children were foolish. If they couldn't love themselves, how could they truly love their kids? But now, as a mother, I understood. I had become the person I once despised. Closing my eyes, I stared at their backs as Michael continued playing with Ethan, and I felt like I was swallowing a mouthful of mud. This would be the last time I gave him a chance. If Michael took the opportunity one was offering, I could pretend nothing had happened and continue this charade of a life with him. But if not, I would make him regret it so deeply it would pierce his very soul. With that thought, I snapped a picture of Michael and Ethan together, captioning it, "Ethan will always be Daddy's precious boy." Though I didn't expect Vanessa to back off after seeing it. I didn't anticipate what happened next. Vanessa boldly commented on my post, her words dripping with sarcasm. "Your son's so clingy with his daddy. Better be careful he doesn't grow up too pampered." Her comment made me laugh out loud, more from anger than amusement. I replied immediately, "You're already 30. Shouldn't you be busy finding a boyfriend instead?" Satisfied with my response, I went to Vanessa's profile to record a video of all the designer bags and jewelry she had been flaunting. If things turned ugly, I'd make her give it all back. But as I was midway through recording, Michael's phone rang. He stepped out onto the balcony to answer it, his expression shifting to one of reluctant indulgence. When he returned, his face was serious. "There's an issue at work. I need to go," he said curtly, not even waiting for my response before turning and leaving as if it was the most natural thing in the world. In the past, I used to think he was simply too busy, so I always sympathized with him. But now, I just found it laughable. It turned out that my patience and understanding were things he took for granted. Just as he reached the door, he turned back and said, "Stop posting random things online. It wouldn't look good if my colleagues saw them. You hear me?" His cold eyes met mine. I used to love that look, thinking he was the aloof prince I had always dreamed of. I adored him so much that I tolerated everything, bending over backward to please him. But now, that same look made me hate him to my core. "Got it," I replied lightly, though my tone had none of my contempt. "But lately, I've only been posting pictures of you and Ethan. What's the big deal?" He paused for a moment before responding irritably. "Doesn't matter. If I said don't post, then don't post. You sit at home all day, clueless about social etiquette. And now you're not even listening? Do I need to teach you everything?" "Okay," I said, biting my lip, feigning hurt. His expression shifted to one of disdain, as if I was nothing more than a foolish woman easy to manipulate. Satisfied, he left without another word. What he didn't realize was that the look of a woman in love and one who no longer cared were two entirely different things. As soon as he was out the door, my face turned cold. I quickly changed out of my pajamas and silently followed him. I found him in the underground parking lot, grabbing Vanessa's hand as they argued. But soon enough, the fight turned into an embrace, then a kiss, one that lasted nearly 10 minutes. Afterward, they drove off together, and I hailed a cab to follow them. They ended up at the apartment Michael had bought 2 years ago, supposedly for his sister, Emily. At that moment, I realized something. Even his doting younger sister, who often asked me for shopping money with her sweet words, knew about all of this. I had been nothing more than a fool in their eyes, someone they could all look down on. The thought made my fists clench tightly. When I returned to our complex, I pretended to have lost something in the parking lot and went to the security office. I managed to get a copy of the surveillance footage showing the two of them entangled with each other, a piece of evidence I would need. Then, I contacted a lawyer to discuss Michael's infidelity, his possible transfer of assets, and the custody of Ethan. The more I talked with the lawyer, the colder I felt. At most, his infidelity would give me a slight advantage in dividing assets. But not by much. Even though I was certain he had hidden assets, I didn't know how many accounts he had or how much was in them. All the household expenses went through the company account, leaving me with little traceable information. And custody? That was even harder. Without a stable job, I had no guarantee of winning custody unless Michael willingly gave it up. Worse, if he took out large loans in our names as a married couple, I would be on the hook for half of it. The possibility of Ethan ending up with him made me feel sick to my stomach. I couldn't believe it. Who exactly was the law protecting? If I hadn't won the lottery, if I had remained oblivious, I would have ended up with nothing in the end. Leaving the lawyer's office, I took a deep breath to clear my mind and began organizing my next steps. The most urgent thing was to cash in the lottery ticket as soon as possible. Although I had 60 days to claim it, it was better to handle it early. I couldn't tell my dad. He had a tendency to brag about everything, and the news would spread like wildfire. The only person I could rely on was my mom. With that thought, I headed straight to my parents' house, showed her the lottery ticket, and explained everything that had happened over the past 2 days. My mom's expression mirrored mine, shifting from joy to anger to a cold and distant calm. But fortunately, she had spent a lifetime keeping my father in check. After listening to my story, she immediately changed into a fresh outfit, put on sunglasses and a mask, and headed out to claim the prize. The two of us sat in a taxi, our hands clasped tightly and damp with sweat. After taxes and donating a portion, we had over 90 million yuan left. When everything was settled, my mom and I collapsed onto the bed, holding the slim card in trembling hands. You can't tell anyone about this, not even your best friend, especially not your father. Understood? My mom's face was stern as she gave me her instructions. My father had grown up in a family that valued sons over daughters, and his harsh upbringing made him treasure money above all else. The second most important person to him was himself. I nodded. Don't worry. I'm not that naive. But my mom only smirked. Who knows? I told you from the start. Michael's cold demeanor shows he doesn't truly care for you. But you insisted, saying he was just reserved and called him the flower on the mountaintop. You always said your relationship was fine. And now look at you. He's warm and affectionate with someone else. There's not a trace of that coldness you were so proud of. But it's fine. Now that we have money, we can find you someone better. There are plenty of handsome men with muscles online. Mom, stop watching those silly things, I replied with a wry smile. Leaving Ethan at home, I decided to clear my head. After some thought, I stopped by a shop to buy soup, poured it into a thermal container, and took it to Michael's office. But as soon as I walked in, the receptionist stopped me. Excuse me, who are you? She asked politely, her tone so unfamiliar it felt distant. Smiling faintly, I said, I'm Michael's wife. I'm here to bring him some soup. Her expression shifted. Startled, she stammered, Oh, the wife of CEO Michael? Let me inform him first. Please wait a moment. No need, I replied. I can go in myself. Her hesitation and awkwardness only fueled my suspicions. Ignoring her protests, I walked straight in, and what I saw confirmed everything. Vanessa, wearing a paper crown, was celebrating her birthday. She was perched on Michael's desk, laughing as she fed him a slice of cake. The room was filled with cheers and laughter from their colleagues. It was a lively scene, until the receptionist awkwardly announced, CEO Michael, your wife is here. The noise died instantly. Vanessa was still holding the fork while Michael, mid-bite, turned to look at me. Everyone else froze like statues. Birthday party. Huh, I said with a smirk. Michael quickly straightened up, his expression slightly uneasy, while Vanessa shot me a look of annoyance as though I were an unwelcome intruder on her turf. Oh, Nina, don't you recognize me? I'm Vanessa, Emily's friend, she said, extending her hand toward me with the air of a hostess. I wanted to throw the soup in her face, but I held back. Oh, hi, I said with a sweet smile, setting the soup container down on the desk. I shook her hand briefly, then turned to Michael. Michael, you really should have told me Vanessa works here. After all, you've watched her grow up since high school, when you were a senior. She was only in 5th grade. But still, having her feed you cake? That's a bit much, don't you think? What if her boyfriend sees this? How embarrassing would that be? I maintained a warm, affectionate smile, but the tension in the room thickened. The colleagues around us exchanged curious glances, clearly enjoying the drama. Michael and Vanessa, on the other hand, looked as if they'd just swallowed something bitter. I almost couldn't hold back my laughter. Ha, so you enjoy sneaking around behind my back? Why don't you try doing it openly? In front of everyone? Go ahead. Let's see if your colleagues are fine with it. If not, I bet this juicy little scandal will spread far and wide. What are you talking about? Vanessa snapped, her face turning red as she pointed at me. If you don't know how to speak properly, then don't make things up. Have you been staying at home as a housewife for so long that you've lost all common sense? Vanessa's words were sharp and insulting. What hurt even more was that Michael said nothing, letting her insult me freely, feigning an innocent and confused expression. I responded softly. Did I say something wrong? I'm sorry, Vanessa. I didn't mean to upset you. Don't call me Vanessa, she snapped, her voice shaking as tears welled up in her eyes. If you hadn't barged in uninvited, that's enough. Michael finally interrupted her. His tone was cold as he turned to me. Come into my office. Now. Without waiting for a response, he walked off, leaving me no choice but to follow him. Once inside, he shut the door firmly and glared at me. I told you not to bring food to the office. You've made everything tense now. What are you trying to do? His voice was filled with irritation. Caught off guard, I put on a cautious and apologetic demeanor. I didn't know it would turn out like this. I'm sorry, Michael. I actually came here to ask if you could help me find a job. A job? He frowned, his voice dripping with disbelief. What could you even do? If you're here because you're suspicious of Vanessa, it's unnecessary. There's nothing between us. His words, paired with his cold, dismissive look, made me feel like I was being irrational. I forced a smile. Vanessa is like a little sister to you. Why would I care? Hearing this, Michael's expression softened slightly. Then why are you suddenly talking about getting a job? I replied calmly. I mentioned this before. I said I'd start working once Ethan goes to preschool. Did you forget? Or are you hiding something from me? As I finished, I playfully pinched his cheek, but my grip was firm. Michael winced and instinctively stepped back, clearly annoyed by my touch. Watching him recoil from me, I felt a pang in my chest. When we first met, I had fallen for him at first sight. His monolid eyes, high nose bridge, and sharp jawline had captivated me. His calm, steady gaze made him seem like the aloof prince I'd always dreamed of, compared to the awkward, unpleasant men I'd met during previous blind dates. He was 100 times better. That's why I had quickly decided he was the one. But looking at him now, 36 years old with calculating eyes, a slightly softened physique, and a receding hairline, I could no longer see the man I once admired. His heart had grown filthy, corrupted by his own selfishness. What would happen to Ethan if Vanessa really had Michael's child? Would Ethan grow up overshadowed and mistreated? Would he turn into a version of Michael, cold and manipulative? I couldn't let that happen. I needed to be strong, no matter how much it hurt. Michael wasn't worth saving anymore. He would bring nothing but harm to Ethan and me. Don't talk nonsense, Michael said coldly, brushing my hand aside. Even if you go out and work, you won't earn much. Why make things hard on yourself? I knew he didn't want me to be independent, but I countered. Isn't your company struggling right now? I thought if I started working, at least if things went south for you, the three of us wouldn't starve. I looked at him with a sincere expression, and for a moment, he hesitated. He hadn't expected me to have such a reasonable excuse. His gaze softened slightly, but inside, I felt nothing but contempt. Michael's selfishness knew no bounds. He only cared about me when it benefited him. That realization solidified my resolve. I couldn't let him control me any longer. I stepped closer and said, I just want to get some accounting experience. Once I get the hang of it, I'll look for another job. Don't worry, I won't be here long. Oh, and don't give me anything related to finances. I wouldn't know what to do with it anyway. I even scratched my head as if embarrassed. playing the role perfectly. Michael's expression twisted into one of disdain, clearly looking down on me, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. My excuse was just too reasonable. Sensing an opportunity, I pressed further. Or maybe you really have something going on with Vanessa, and you're afraid I'll cause a scene if I work here. He quickly denied it. His new company wasn't stable yet, and I guessed he didn't want a big fight with me at this point. After a moment of thought, he reluctantly agreed. Fine. I'll let the finance department know. Great. I'll start tomorrow, I said cheerfully, stepping forward to plant a big kiss on his cheek, leaving a lipstick mark. He immediately wiped it off in annoyance. But I had already opened the door. As expected, Vanessa was standing outside. Her eyes darted past me to Michael, filled with both worry and anger, as if she were the one being betrayed. I felt a wave of disgust but maintained my shy act. Oh, it's nothing, I said casually before turning to Vanessa with a sweet smile. Oh, right. Vanessa, it's your birthday today, isn't it? Where's that boyfriend who always gets you gifts? Her face darkened. Her lips pressed tightly together as tears welled in her eyes. She glared at Michael before storming off. What a pathetic sight. I watched her retreating figure with a smirk, and Michael hastily tried to explain. She's been arguing with her boyfriend lately. I need to go check on her. You head home first. Okay. Feigning understanding, I nodded, but inside, I thought, what a pair of miserable fools. Go ahead and destroy each other. That evening, I saw Vanessa's latest post on social media. She shared a photo of a candlelit dinner and a brand new Chanel bag. Captioned, I bet some old hag has never even touched something like this. I immediately took a screenshot. The next day, at work, Vanessa deliberately showed off her new bag near my desk, her gaze dripping with provocation. I pretended not to notice and walked over. Oh, Vanessa, send me the link to where you bought that bag, will you? It's gorgeous. Her face darkened instantly. This is Chanel. It's over $50,000 for one, she snapped, feigning surprise. I gasped. Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was that expensive. Honestly, I couldn't tell at all. I smiled calmly and sat back at my desk. A few colleagues nearby couldn't hold back their laughter. Vanessa glared at me furiously, clutching her bag tightly as she stormed over to my desk. What's that supposed to mean? I looked up at her with a confused expression. What do you mean? What are you talking about? Are you saying I'm not worthy of this bag? She hissed, her teeth clenched. I just smiled, said nothing, and turned back to my computer. I asked one of the finance team members about my tasks for the day, completely ignoring her. Left with no response, Vanessa stood there for a moment before storming off in frustration. Watching her retreat, I deliberately looked puzzled. Isn't it work hours? Why is she leaving now? The finance team member, a woman more than 10 years older than me who clearly disliked Vanessa but didn't want to openly offend her, quietly explained. She's in sales. She probably has to go out for work. I nodded without pressing further and chatted with the rest of the team while treating everyone to bubble tea and pastries. I acted as though I didn't have a care in the world. Some of the staff looked at me with pity, but I pretended not to notice. After all, the bubble tea was paid for with Michael's card. A while later, Michael called me into his office, his tone tense. Why are you spending so much money? He demanded. I smiled and said, 15 cups of bubble tea for the staff only cost $323. Meanwhile, you bought your mistress a $51,800 handbag, and that's just one of them. From the posts she shares on social media, I've counted at least several $100,000 worth of luxury items, not to mention the dinners and hotels, which I'm sure aren't cheap either. And now you're telling me I've spent too much. I adjusted my expression, softening it slightly. I just started at the company and wanted to do something nice for the staff. I'm representing you. After all, I can't let you lose face. I smiled as I spoke, but inside, the thin layer of glass protecting my heart had long since shattered. I began piecing together every small detail from the past few years. And finally, I came to a clear realization about who Michael really was. A selfish, heartless man without a shred of responsibility. As long as something benefited him, everything else could be pushed aside. Vanessa's enthusiasm and freshness might excite him now, but over time, the novelty would wear off. The red rose would eventually become nothing more than a bloodstain from a mosquito. I was genuinely curious to see how sweet their relationship would remain once they were truly together. For now, my role as the perfect wife was all I needed to play. Sure enough, Michael's expression softened a little. "Next time, let me know before you do something like this," he said. Just as he finished, his phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw the name Sweet Little Darling. Michael immediately declined the call. Glancing at me cautiously, I turned to look out the window and said with a smile, "The view from here is lovely." Through the reflection in the glass, I saw him exhale in relief, but the phone rang again, and his annoyance began to show. "Is it a client?" I asked, feigning innocence. He pressed his lips together and nodded. "I'll leave you to it, then," I said. "How about I make braised pork ribs for dinner tonight?" His expression softened a little more. "Sure." Not long after, Michael told me he had to meet a client that evening and wouldn't be home for dinner. I had anticipated this and pretended to be disappointed. Later, as I stepped into the break room, Ms. Wong from the finance department followed me in. I greeted her warmly. Over the past month, the tension between Vanessa and me had been palpable, leaving Michael visibly irritable and cold toward me. Despite this, Ms. Wong had been relatively kind and occasionally stood up for me. To my surprise, she let out a long sigh. "Is something wrong?" I asked, concerned. She hesitated before replying with a heavy heart. "I have a younger sister whose husband is cheating on her. He's bold enough to bring the other woman to their company, and they're openly dating there. It's disgusting." I was taken aback. "That's awful," I said. Ms. Wong nodded, shaking my head in disbelief. I added, "How shameless. Luckily, my husband, Michael, is a good man." Ms. Wong froze for a moment, her expression unreadable. I smiled cheerfully and told her not to dwell on it before heading back to my desk. At work, I didn't trust anyone. That evening, after playing with Ethan, I listened to the recording I had made earlier. While delivering coffee that afternoon, I had planted a listening device under Michael's desk. To my surprise, I heard a conversation between Michael and Ms. Wong. "Has your wife figured anything out yet? She was just telling me how you're such a good husband," Ms. Wong said. After a pause, Michael replied, "Not yet." He quickly changed the topic. "Is everything set up at the new company?" "Almost. I'll send it to you tomorrow," she replied. I removed the earphones, my hands cold. A liar through and through. The next day, I acted as if nothing had happened, going about my tasks as usual. I sorted through some old documents from 2 years ago and scrolled through TikTok videos when bored, completely ignoring Vanessa's smug glances. She was pathetic. So what if Michael hadn't come home last night? He wasn't worth my concern. After work, I made my way to Ms. Wong's desk. I turned on her computer, having memorized her password long ago. Once the computer was up, I copied all the files from her folder onto a USB drive. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind countless times. My hands were drenched in sweat by the time I was finished. It wasn't until I stepped out of the office building that I finally let out a deep breath. Thankfully, Ms. Wong had done an excellent job organizing everything. The documents were meticulously categorized into 2 sets, one genuine and one fake. The real documents revealed that over the past several years, the company had been making nearly $1 million in profit annually, and yet Michael constantly played the role of a struggling husband in front of me, claiming poverty. Every month, he'd give me 15,000 yuan for living expenses, of which nearly 10,000 yuan went toward the mortgage and car payments. We barely scraped by, with my parents often stepping in to help. I used to think he didn't share his struggles with me out of pride, but in reality, he was sending nearly 400,000 yuan a year to his parents and splurging on luxury goods for Vanessa or extravagant vacations. He was living the high life while I stayed up at night worrying about how to stretch our budget. What a despicable man. I sent the files to my mom, saved a copy to the cloud, and shut down the computer. Almost immediately, Michael called. The timing was so perfect that I couldn't help but scoff, getting anxious. "Are we finished setting up the new company and ready to talk divorce now?" I answered the call, and Michael's voice came through. Nina, let's get a divorce. I rolled my eyes. Why? There was a long silence before he finally replied. I just think we're not a good match. Not a good match? After 5 years of marriage, you suddenly think we're not a good match? I yelled, nearly losing control. Are you cheating on me? He hesitated before finally admitting. Yes, I've fallen for someone else. I was momentarily stunned, almost unable to maintain my act. I hadn't expected him to admit it so bluntly. She's someone I've always liked. He continued. She's sweet and kind. I know this is my fault, and I owe you an apology. Who is she? I demanded. You don't need to know, he said. No way. I will never agree to a divorce. Do you think it's that easy? I hung up immediately, then headed to the kitchen to chop onions, tears streaming down my face. Not from sadness, but from frustration. If it weren't for Ethan's custody, I wouldn't even bother pretending with him. To my surprise, Vanessa couldn't hold back and called me herself. The moment I picked up, she sneered. He's finally divorcing you. A washed-up old hag like you still clinging to him? I suggest you just give up gracefully. Otherwise, you'll only make things worse for yourself. I hung up without another word, fuming. A mistress boasting like that? I recorded the call just in case. That evening, Michael came home, carrying bags of luxury goods Vanessa had clearly bought for him. I couldn't hold it in any longer. All the pent-up anger of the past weeks erupted. I lunged at him, clawing and hitting, releasing every ounce of frustration. Vanessa barged in, trying to pull me off him, but I turned and slapped her hard across the face. Her expensive necklace broke in the scuffle, and she shrieked, kicking at me with her high heels. Michael, now sporting several scratches on his face, panicked and rushed over to protect Vanessa. But as she attempted to kick me again, I sidestepped, and her heel landed squarely in Michael's groin. His face turned pale as he doubled over in pain. Everyone froze, stunned. I barely managed to stifle my laughter. Feigning concern, I rushed forward. Oh no, honey. Are you okay? I cried, pretending to trip and fall against him. Adding to his misery, he let out a loud wail of pain. Amid the chaos, an ambulance arrived. Vanessa, clearly not in a position to stay and care for him, reluctantly hailed a cab to the hospital. I, however, stayed by Michael's side, holding his hand reassuringly. Don't worry, I said sweetly. I'm sure everything will be fine down there. Shut up, he roared, unable to contain his anger. By now, half the building was aware of the commotion. Michael, humiliated and in pain, finally dropped all pretenses. Enough. I'm done with this charade, he snarled, his true colors fully revealed. Michael and Vanessa claimed their love was true. She was pregnant, and he insisted on getting a divorce. His family offered a hollow apology but made snide remarks about me, criticizing my lack of education, inability to keep up with modern times, and claiming I wasn't as beautiful as Vanessa. They kept repeating that Vanessa had studied abroad, as if that gave her some moral superiority. My mom was so furious that she cursed them outright. I, too, confronted Michael with screenshots of Vanessa's posts flaunting expensive gifts. Did you buy all these for her? I demanded. I'll sue her. Michael snapped, yelling, Nina, I'm already 10 million in debt. How about this? If we divorce, you'll help me pay it off. I laughed coldly. Fine, let's pay it off together. Push me far enough, and I'll drag both of you down with me. My eyes burned with anger as I cursed at him, leaving him momentarily speechless. Finally, he sneered and said, What about Ethan? Are you just going to abandon him? I couldn't believe it. You're using Ethan to threaten me now? Is he not your son too? I shouted, seeing me so furious. He smirked as if he had the upper hand. So what if he is? I sank into a chair, my voice hoarse. You're unbelievable. I had imagined this scene countless times, but nothing could have prepared me for the cruelty of his words. Don't regret this, I said, glaring at him. I never regret anything, he replied coldly. Once the mediation period ended, we went to the civil affairs office to finalize the divorce. Vanessa was waiting outside, and Michael looked smug, clearly expecting to see me devastated. Instead, I was all smiles, as if I had just thrown out the trash. I even greeted him cheerfully, which made Michael frown in confusion. Vanessa, stunned by my demeanor, decided to provoke me. Stop pretending. If you're sad, just admit it. Acting like this only makes you look pitiful. I burst out laughing. What? You're so proud of catching a wilted cucumber? Last time I checked, it couldn't even hold up after getting kicked. My words left them both frozen in shock. The unexpected shift in my attitude threw them off completely. For the past 3 months, they had grown used to seeing me as the pitiful, defeated wife. My sudden bluntness unsettled them, but I didn't care. They'd get used to it eventually. Michael turned red with anger. Nina, have you gone crazy? Not as disgusting as the pair of adulterers standing in front of me. I shot back, then walked away with a spring in my step, leaving them standing there dumbfounded. I didn't care about them anymore. Custody of Ethan was mine, and no one could be worse off than I had been these past years. As I left, I called Chris Tran, one of Michael's former business partners. They used to have dinner together regularly, but for some reason, they had fallen out. I never asked why, but given Michael's awful personality, I suspected Chris had been betrayed. When Chris picked up, he sounded surprised. Nina, why are you calling me? Without hesitation, I said, Michael cheated. We're divorced now. I want to ask, if you had the chance, would you take down his company? Chris paused before laughing bitterly. Back then, he took all my capital. Now his company is far bigger than mine. Even if I had support, I don't have the money to start over. That's fine. I do. I replied calmly. After all, I was now a wealthy woman with over 90 million yuan. Meeting Chris again after 3 years, I saw that he hadn't changed much. His personality, however, had shifted. Once lively and outgoing, he now carried himself with a calm, mature demeanor. As he recounted his history with Michael, I felt disgusted. It turned out that while Michael did have some connections at the start, most of the initial capital and resources had come from Chris. Things went well in the beginning, but once the business started thriving, Michael schemed to take over the new distribution channels Chris had established and forced him out entirely. That's classic Michael for you, Chris said, smirking. I'll need quite a bit of capital. Around 1 million yuan. Is that doable? I agreed without hesitation. It was just a few months' worth of interest. And if it meant pushing Michael's company to bankruptcy, it was worth every cent. Besides, there was potential for equity too. Chris seemed surprised at how quickly I agreed, but he didn't question me further. He immediately began registering the company online, hiring staff, and working tirelessly. I could see a hint of ruthlessness in his eyes, and I couldn't help but wonder if he'd deliver a fatal blow to Michael. But honestly, it didn't matter to me. I was merely giving him a little push. If Chris failed, I still had the evidence to use as leverage. Meanwhile, I focused on enjoying life. I took Ethan and my parents on a 3-week vacation to celebrate the new year. We stayed in the most luxurious hotels, leaving my family in awe. The happiness that came with wealth was beyond anything they'd ever imagined. Shopping became a carefree activity. We didn't check prices in duty-free shops and bought whatever caught our eye. As for the handbags Vanessa treated like treasures, I didn't even glance at them. I didn't need material things to prove my worth. All I wanted was a peaceful, happy life with my parents and my son. Back in Greenfield City, I felt restless despite the peace. We moved into a new 4-bedroom, 2-bath apartment in a top-tier school district downtown. Ethan had a nanny to take him to and from school, and she also handled the housework. My mom spent her days dancing in the square, while my dad went fishing with his buddies. I, on the other hand, had too much free time. So, I enrolled in a makeup course. I have to admit, seeing my reflection looking prettier each day did wonders for my mood. The course, which cost tens of thousands of yuan, was worth every penny. Gradually, I built a small following and even started receiving sponsorship offers. It was so fulfilling. As for my dad, he eventually found out about the lottery win and was over the moon. He immediately upgraded his fishing gear, buying a 20,000 yuan rod, which left my mom exasperated but happy nonetheless. Money really did make life easier. Vanessa, on the other hand, continued sending me smug messages on WeChat. flaunting her so-called happiness. I couldn't help but laugh. Life carried on, and soon Ethan was about to start elementary school. In the meantime, I began dating a stunningly handsome man. Every day was filled with joy and excitement. But then, out of the blue, Michael called me. "Nina, I was wrong. I miss you so much," he said, his voice tired but filled with longing. His words made me want to vomit. "You're insane," I snapped, hanging up immediately. To my shock, Michael started showing up at the makeup school I was attending. He said he'd been watching me for a while. "Are you out of your mind? I don't need you stalking me," I yelled, annoyed beyond belief. Finally, unable to take it any longer, he admitted, "I heard your family won the lottery." I raised an eyebrow. So much for my dad's ability to keep a secret. But it didn't matter. My mom was in charge of the finances, and Michael had no access to a single cent. "And? What's it got to do with you?" I said lazily. "Nina," he softened his tone, "I'm still Ethan's father. The company's been struggling lately. Can you help me out? You don't know how extravagant Vanessa is. She spends money like water, doesn't do any housework. And that prestigious school she went to in the US? It's a total scam. Not even on par with your university here. On top of that, she drank while she was pregnant. And after giving birth, she dumped the baby on my mom. Nina, you're still the best. You were wrong back then, so now you want us to start over." Michael rattled off one excuse after another, making my eyebrows furrow tighter with every word. "Michael, are you sick in the head?" I snapped, glaring at him with pure disdain. "Do you remember how you humiliated and insulted me before? Or have you conveniently forgotten? Why on earth would I want to reconcile with you? Get lost. You're disgusting." I rolled my eyes, turning to leave, but he grabbed my arm tightly. This time, he wasn't pretending anymore. "That lottery ticket was bought during our marriage, wasn't it? That makes it marital property. I'm entitled to half," he said through gritted teeth. I was momentarily stunned by his shamelessness. For a moment, I couldn't even respond. I studied him carefully. Less than a year after our divorce, he had already transformed into a balding, overweight middle-aged man. His hair was thinning, his once sharp features now bloated, and even a few strands of gray hair had crept in. His whole demeanor exuded exhaustion and decline. I smirked. "If you knew Chris Tran started his company using my money, you'd probably lose your mind," I thought, seeing his stunned expression. I sighed. "Back then, I begged you not to divorce me, but you insisted you had found your true love. How naive I was." His face darkened, regret clouding his eyes. He seemed to want to say something, but I was already getting into a luxury car he had once dreamed of but couldn't afford. I started the engine and sped away, leaving him standing there in his misery. "Eat your heart out, you pathetic loser." After dealing with Michael, I decided to take Ethan shopping at the mall. Unexpectedly, I ran into Vanessa. She was still dressed provocatively and wearing heavy makeup, but it couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes or the unease that radiated from her. She was holding a crying child, while Michael's mother, Mrs. Tran, stood beside her, scolding her relentlessly. What a small world. I hadn't seen Vanessa post anything on social media in ages. This was the same woman who used to send me videos bragging about her love with Michael. "Oh, isn't this Nina?" Mrs. Tran's voice rang out as she spotted me, and she immediately approached to make small talk. I didn't forget how she used to belittle me, so I ignored her completely. Vanessa, on the other hand, stared at me with eyes full of resentment and dissatisfaction. I offered her nothing but a cold, mocking smile before walking straight into a store she wouldn't dare enter. Michael was now barely scraping by under the pressure from Chris Tran. His finances were in shambles, leaving him no money for romantic gestures. Vanessa, once an illegitimate child herself, had been cast out after her biological father's family discovered her schemes. And Michael, who had relied on his wife to build his fortune, was now estranged from his own family. They had no intention of helping him either. Of course, I had a hand in spreading the news that led to their downfall. As I shopped, Mrs. Tran's envious gaze followed me. She turned her frustration back on Vanessa, calling her a conniving homewrecker and lamenting her misfortune. But wasn't Michael the most to blame? Who knew when their affair had even started? A few months later, Michael called me again, begging for a second chance. Nina, I was wrong. It was Vanessa who seduced me. I never liked her. She's just a vulgar woman. Not even worth comparing to you. Michael rambled on, his words growing more pathetic by the second. I couldn't help but laugh at how predictable he was. He must have gone bankrupt. Let me guess, I said, cutting him off. She forced you to buy luxury goods, forced you to kiss her, and even forced you to sleep with her. Is that it, Michael? Other than blaming others, is there anything you're actually good at? I'm disgusted by you. With that, I hung up and immediately called Chris Tran to confirm. Hearing my story, Chris was just as surprised. I was about to tell you. He's lost all his funding. Looks like you already figured it out, he said with a chuckle. I exchanged a few pleasantries before ending the call, feeling even more certain that it was time for me to leave this place behind. On the day Ethan started elementary school, Michael hesitated before calling me, excitedly announcing, I divorced Vanessa. I smirked. Couldn't even last 3 years. Huh? Wasn't it true love? But then Michael turned around and filed a lawsuit against me, claiming I had transferred assets during our marriage. It was laughable. I immediately submitted copies of my previous bank statements, along with a detailed report to the tax office, which included evidence of his tax evasion. The investigation revealed there were no large sums of money in my accounts, as I had only ever used the secondary card linked to my mother's account. Michael's face turned ashen when he realized the truth. He was left with nothing. Even if he sold his parents' house and his sister's apartment, it wouldn't be enough to cover the massive debts he had accrued. When we divorced, we had signed an agreement stating that I left with nothing, and his debts were solely his responsibility. Now, the tax authorities were coming after him. If he didn't repay the evaded taxes, he'd face prison time. This time, Michael completely crumbled. Before being taken away, he glared at me with reddened eyes, shouting, Nina, you're heartless. You've been pretending all this time. I gave him a cold smile. We're all the same, Michael. He sneered bitterly. If you'd been this smart from the start, maybe I really would have loved you. I raised an eyebrow. Was he delusional? Was he suggesting that I was too kind, too forgiving, and that's why he had looked down on me and thought he could manipulate me? It was absurd. Who even plays mind games with their own family and friends every day? I muttered, realizing there was no point in reasoning with someone like him. Don't waste your breath, I said, turning to leave. But then I heard his voice again, tinged with regret. If I hadn't cheated, would we have been happy now? I laughed, deliberately mocking him. Oh, probably. The 3 of us would be traveling around the world. Right. With that, I got into my car and drove off. Through the rearview mirror, I saw Michael collapse to his knees, his hands covering his face. Who knows what was going through his mind? A few days later, the news broke. Michael had been arrested for attempted murder. He had taken a butcher knife and tried to kill Vanessa in the middle of the street, blaming her for ruining everything. She ended up with a long scar across her face. And Michael, with overwhelming evidence against him, was sentenced to life in prison. I couldn't help but marvel at his talent for blaming others even to the bitter end. But it didn't matter anymore. He'd never walk free again. Deciding to send him a final gift, I visited him in prison. He sat across from me, his head shaved and dressed in a prison uniform. Through the glass, he picked up the phone, his eyes welling up with tears. He opened his mouth to speak. I spoke first. Oh, by the way, Chris Tran? I funded him. Michael froze, his face paling as veins bulged on his forehead. Without waiting for his reaction, I hung up the phone. Through the glass, I saw him lunge toward it like a wild animal, screaming in rage and despair. His face contorted with anger and anguish as he banged against the barrier, his voice echoing through the room. 2 prison guards rushed in, struggling to restrain him. I curled my lips into a small smile. It seemed like he appreciated my little gift. Satisfied, I turned and walked away, leaving behind everything connected to him. Everything. That is, except my precious son. When I got home, Ethan was sitting at his desk, diligently working on his homework. My parents were out on the balcony, engrossed in a game of chess. The The house was warm and filled with peace. Looking at this cozy scene, I felt a deep sense of contentment. As for marriage, it was no longer on my mind. With time, money, and the people I loved by my side, I was confident that the future would be bright.